laws, policies, and risk. So what are we talking about when we say healthcare compliance? Healthcare compliance refers to a suite of laws listed here on the slide. And these laws collectively are really designed to do one or more of the following three things. Number one, prevent harm to patients and improve the quality of healthcare services. Number two, keep medical decision-making free from improper influence and misinformation. And number three, government does not want to pay, and government is a big payer here, for services and goods that people do not actually need. So these laws also try to prevent overpayments for things that they don't need. Now, why do these laws matter? Of course, they matter most importantly to keep patients safe. And that really, I know pharma gets a bad rap, but that is really incredibly important for all your biopharma partners. That being said, in addition, companies and individuals at the helm of these companies, when there are violations of these laws, they can be incredibly costly. They can lead to jail time. They can result in the company being excluded from participating in federal healthcare programs. That means none of their products would ever be reimbursed again, which is essentially the death knell for these companies. It would drive them out of business. So we want to protect patients. We also want to avoid some of these big harms. And, in 2022, it was, I think the president even referenced this in his State of the Union in terms of fraud and enforcement. It was kind of a light year, about $1.5 billion in terms of penalties across 16 biopharma device companies. $1.5 billion this past year. 2021, it was almost $6 billion. A lot of that was derived from some of the opioid crisis activities, but that $6 billion was not an exclusive outlier. In 2014, it was over $6 billion as well. Okay, so these are real consequences, real costs. But when companies think about their relationships with advocacy organizations and advocates, there really are two laws that bubble to the top. The first is the anti-kickback statute. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the statute, but just to reiterate for our newbies, it provides that it's a felony if the company offers anything of value, sometimes known as the fancy term of remuneration, but could be anything of value, money, meals, travel, if one purpose, and just one purpose, is in exchange for someone using, prescribing, purchasing, or recommending a product that's reimbursed by a federal healthcare program. Okay, so as advocates, you certainly could, I'll say could, be in a position to recommend a product or service. Okay, and we'll talk more about it later, but one thing I want to highlight here is that the kickback statute is really keyed off of and tied to reimbursement for a product. Why does that matter? What does that mean? If you're a company without an approved product at all, without anything being paid for by Medicare and Medicaid, it makes it a little bit more or a lot more difficult for the government to make a case around the kickback statute. Now, theoretically, they could say something they do today before approval could impact referrals and recommendations post-approval. It does just make it a little bit more challenging. So coming back to the law, if a company is paying you, an organization, money, and they're paying it to support an upcoming patient education event, but wink, wink, nod, nod, they also know by doing so, they can expect your recommendation of the product, they could be violating the kickback statute. Okay. In case I hit a nerve or triggered something, of course, pharma companies pay organizations all the time to share product and trial information, right? We may see organizations offering payment or getting payment for sharing product ads in quarterly magazines, or if you have a conference and you have a bag that's going out to attendees, there's maybe an opportunity for them to put an ad in those bags. I want to reiterate that those payments are not payments for you to recommend or endorse their products. They're payments of fair market value for a service or a tangible benefit that you are providing to the company. Okay. They're not for your recommendation at all. Now, there's several ways that we make this intent clear. And that can be making sure that this payment is this fair market value thing that, again, I'm going to put a pin and talk about that later. It's also using disclaimers to make sure that it's very clear what is your communication versus what is the company's communication. It's also the structure of the funding, which we will definitely talk about in detail in the second section. But I'm also going to pause because it's not just the structure, the agreement, the amount of the disclaimers, but I think as advocacy organizations, you should always be thoughtful about the type of opportunities you might want to offer up in terms of sponsorship or funding. So let me give you an example, and I haven't actually seen this, but just to put it out there. If you have a web page, and on the web page you have a list of all the products that are approved for a particular condition, and say you list them in alphabetical order. Theoretically, could you offer the company an opportunity for their product to be listed first as part of a sponsorship benefit? I mean, you could, but I would highly discourage you from doing that because it starts to look like they've paid you specifically for an endorsement to highlight their product, particularly in a context like your webpage, where it's supposed to be a neutral listing of what's available. It starts to look like a paid endorsement. So yes, we'll structure it right. We'll make sure the payment's right. But also, as you're thinking through what you could be offering as sponsorship benefits, make sure nothing could ring or sound or seem like an endorsement of the company's product. Okay, that's law number one. Law number two, that is the biggie, and that's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and implementing regulations. Now, FDA regulations govern pretty much everything that pharma companies do in terms of drug development, production, manufacturing, all the responsibilities in clinical trials. But when I'm talking about it in our context, it's really about the regulations relating to what companies can say and can't say about their approved and investigational products. So prior to a drug approval, company can't assert that the drug is safe or effective. If they are talking about the results of their study, and there are only certain contexts where they can talk about those, they have to be really careful about how they frame those results. Now, some companies will take a very rigid stance on this, and in fact, with you as advocates, will not proactively share the data about unapproved products unless you ask. That's just how people say it because they're not supposed to promote. And so proactive sharing of data can sometimes feel like promotion, particularly for conservative companies. When we're thinking about communications about products before they're approved, also companies also have to be careful to make sure that the communications are approved by IRBs in certain circumstances because it could be construed as part of the informed consent process. So those are the biggies when it comes to unapproved products. After approval, any statement that a company makes about their product, whether written or verbal, has to be consistent with the approved label. I'm sure many, if not all of you, have heard about things being on label, right? On label doesn't just mean the approved indication. It doesn't just mean if your drug's approved for kidney cancer, you can't promote it for breast cancer. It also means if your drug's approved for twice daily dosing, you can't recommend once daily dosing unless there are dose modifications that are specifically in the label. If your drug's approved for being given in combination with something else, you can't promote it as monotherapy. In addition, when you talk about what your drug may or may not do, all the claims, they have to be supported by an appropriate level of evidence from a clinical trial. And consistent with that, you can't overstate the efficacy. And then, as I'm sure you have all seen, because you live in the United States and many probably have a TV, you need to balance what you say around effectiveness with safety information, and you need to make adequate disclosure of all the important safety risks. So if you go to any product website, you have that incredibly annoying sticky ISI that makes it virtually impossible to read the rest of the page, but it's down there at the bottom. That's part of the regulations to make sure that the companies are making adequate provision around the safety information. Now, the standards here, they can be tricky to apply. They're definitely subjective. And so companies employ review committees to assess and render judgment on every piece of material that goes out the door. You may have heard of these if you've worked with pharma for a long time, like PRC, MRC, MLR. It's a cross-functional team that's comprised of someone from medical to make sure it's medically accurate, someone from legal to make sure it's complies with the law, and someone from regulatory to check to make sure it's consistent with the labeling and filed with the agency. So this can be tricky stuff. And it's tricky also because the standards apply both the statements that the company makes and to statements and materials shared by someone who's acting as their agent. So we all know companies do speaker programs. They hire doctors to present to other doctors. What those doctors say and the slides they use have to be approved by the company, have to be consistent with the label. Okay. What does this mean for you? You share information about products on your website, about trials on your website. What do you need to think about? Well, it depends if the content is being developed independently by you as an organization, or if this is content that you are being paid to share or being asked to share by the company. If you are being asked to or paid to share the information, you are essentially their agent, okay? And you need to follow the FDA guidelines. You should take what they give you, share it verbatim, share it without comment. If you're not, guidelines don't apply. Just like they, off-label doesn't apply to physicians. They can prescribe for whatever they want. The way we structure the financing agreement impacts this piece as well. So another thing to keep in mind as we go forward. Okay. So the law is the law is the law, but you say it is so different depending on which of my biopharma sponsors I'm talking to. Why is it so different, right? Well, companies actually implement policies and procedures to reduce the risk of violating these laws. So the law doesn't say, and I'm taking it in a different context, you can't spend more than X dollars on a meal with a healthcare professional or a patient advocate. That's the policies. And the policies are designed to make it look like any meal does not appear to be or couldn't risk having the impact of being a kickback, okay, for example. And what company policies look like can depend on a lot of things. It can depend on the stage of product development. If you don't have an approved product, you might not have a compliance attorney. You might not have perceive that risk as it relates to the kickback statute because we know it's a bit more attenuated. If you have other approved products, you're probably going to be a little bit more risk averse. Company size makes a difference. If you have a lot of products out there, if you're doing grants and sponsorships and paying money out in a lot of different places, you're going to want to have more controls because you have less visibility into it. Also, if you go down the path the wrong way and then you repeat it over and over again, it just makes you a bigger target. The government is unlikely to go after any company for one misstep one time, but when you get bigger and you repeat your behaviors over and over, that's where companies could get into trouble. Certainly, if there's an enforcement history, companies may be operating under what's called a corporate integrity agreement, which requires that they have specific policies and reporting procedures in place. They have a lot of external auditors. This may make their decisions a bit more conservative. Whether there are a lot of competitors in the space, and this can cut both ways, okay? So if there are a lot of competitors out there, companies might be conservative because they're living in a glass house and they don't want their competitors scrutinizing what they're doing. On the flip side, they could be more aggressive because it's a more challenging marketplace. It all comes down to some of the corporate philosophy, who's at the helm, who's running the show, and it can vary significantly. Now, policies and procedures are very much informed by the pharma code, by the standards from corporate integrity agreements that start to become kind of benchmarks. But there is a lot of variation, and for good or for bad, in the patient advocacy space, since there haven't been quite as many settlements and other things of that nature, we don't have as many of those CIAs or other things to go on in terms of our policies and procedures. So you are going to see some variation. I know it's like a highly unsatisfying answer, but it may be so. A lot of companies, I think, when making their risk decisions, not only look to the laws themselves and the policies, but definitely also to how a funding decision or an activity could be perceived. It's pretty standard for company compliance teams to ask their the folks in the company to think about how an action or activity they may pursue could be perceived when described by an unfriendly reporter on the front of the New York Times or some other newspaper. How could the program be spun? And these are actual headlines, right, about the relationship between advocacy organizations and pharma. And we know that they've been scrutinized and they'll be continued to be scrutinized. So a lot of times when something might come up in terms of, can a company do it in partnership with you or not, you'll fall back also to this front page test, or they will. And in this regard, I got specifically a question from someone is, how much is too much? There's some smaller groups on the call, and maybe there's only one pharma company doing research in this space. Do we need to cap the percent of our revenues that can come from that one company? The companies need to cap that percentage. And I've seen different approaches. Some companies will say, hey, we can't fund more than X percent of total program revenue. And they have that policy out there. Some companies say, hey, you know what? We cannot fund certain activities, certain startup costs, certain infrastructure costs. Why is that? Both in terms of the overall magnitude of the funding and also the types. They want to avoid the perception or fact of having an undue influence over over what you do as an organization. They want you to be strong, independent partners across the table, and they don't want anything that they do to potentially make it hard for you to make decisions that might go against them, or not against them, but that may not necessarily align perfectly with their interests. So what does this mean, or how do I think this might mean, what this means for all of you as advocates? First, be proactive. Understand what your pharma partners' rules are. Ask them. It's okay to ask. But you also may want to get out in front of it on your side. Establish clear organizational guidelines on your interactions with pharmaceutical companies. What will you accept in terms of support? What types of sponsorships will you offer? And also, seek, and I know it's much easier said than done, but seek to broaden your base of support as much as possible. It might mean that you don't grow quite as quickly as you'd like, but hopefully you will still get there, and you'll get there in the right way.